before those start, I just wanted to say a couple of things actually about my own experience of Cathy. As Anna Eavis said, then we moved, Anna and I moved to Oxford at around the same time that Cathy did. And that's really when I first encountered her and went on to do some teaching for the University Department of Continuing Education, where Cathy, of course, was a departmental lecturer in the history of art. And she was a tremendous colleague to have, I mean, very generous. And as Anna said, very sparky as well. And so it was possible to collaborate on a number of projects while she was there. She was very open, really, to various different suggestions. And we used to have little brainstorming sessions, usually twice a year, as to what study days or mini conferences that we might put on over the following year. And some very interesting events really came out of that. Including a conference on chantries, which Cathy, in fact, contributed to. But I was aware of her before ever meeting her. And the reason was because of a book which came out in 2000, entitled Romanesque Churches of the Loire and Western France. I'm not sure if this will actually sort of show up on the screen, or the fetching image of Aulnay you can see on the front cover. Which is a book she was a joint author and was very modest about, but actually it's a tremendously helpful book, and she's responsible in large part for all the contributions that are concerned with imagery, and particularly sculpture, architectural sculpture, within that book. And it's a very sort of rich gazetteer and account in which one might dip. So I sort of warmly recommend it. It's out of print, but there are secondhand copies which are available. Otherwise, I'm going to leap in. I'd like to remind you all that in order to ask questions, you should use the Q&A slot rather than the chat box. So use the Q&A box if you could. It's much easier for us to see those questions. And one question has come up in the meantime between sessions about whether or not these sessions will actually be available as videos, whether they're being recorded. And the simple answer is that most of them are, and that they will become available on the British Archaeological Association website once they've been put up, which would take about a week, I would think. So they go on the BAA YouTube channel. Otherwise, it's my great pleasure to introduce Teresa Lane, who is a PhD student at the Courtauld. She had a career as a lawyer before, I don't know, the penny dropped, or you saw the light, or the potential of medieval art history presented itself. And she's working with Alex Bovey and John Loudon on a PhD entitled The Trinity and Visual Culture of England, 950 to 1150. So really core early medieval stuff, which I'm delighted to encounter. And she's giving a paper entitled Revisiting the Quinity, the Virgin Mary in Aelfwyn's Prayer Book. Over to you, Teresa.
Thank you, John. I'm just going to share my screen. And in the spirit of the speakers that have preceded me, I just wanted to thank John and the BAA and particularly Sally Dorma for inviting me to speak and to give a paper. It's a great honour, and I'm very, very pleased to be speaking to you this morning. It's also a wonderful chance for me to mention the impact that Cathy had on me. As John said, my journey to art history is via a career in a city law firm before I saw the light. I was a medievalist, I should say, in my defence to start with. My BA degree was in English and Medieval Art at Exeter University, so you could say that the law was a bit of a digression in between. However, I found my way back to art via the wonderful year courses at the V&A, which I think many in the audience will be familiar with. And it was here in the early medieval year course that I first, of course, encountered the wonderful scholarship and generosity of Cathy Oakes, and indeed Sally, and also, of course, Paula Nuttall. I can only say that all three have been instrumental in my journey to pursuing postgraduate research at the Courtauld, and as John said, I hope to be completing my PhD later this year. Certainly, Kathy was so generous with her feedback, and I found in preparation for today, looking back on some of my notes, the essay I did for her on the Utrecht Psalter, and I found her careful notations and feedback, which gave me pause to think and to remember her fondly. So I record publicly here how grateful I am to her, and also to the ongoing mentorship provided by Sally, which has been so helpful to me. So to move on to my paper, my focus today is going to be on this image and broadly, more broadly, the prayer book that it is contained within, which is known colloquially as the Quinity, and it features in Alfred's prayer book. The reason I've chosen this is because it's core to my PhD research, but also more fundamentally, I felt that actually it chimes very well with the scholarship of Kathy, and in particular her publication Ora Pro Nobis, which I found very influential and helpful to me over the last few years. In Ora Pro Nobis, Kathy obviously explores the iconography of the Virgin Mary in medieval art, and highlights the Virgin in her role as, or in depictions of Virgin and Child, the Virgin as intercessor, and the Virgin as the provider of divine mercy. And of course, already today, we've encountered all of those images of the Virgin. So the depictions of the Virgin Mary in Alfred's prayer book, I think, speak to all of those themes and many more that are in Kathy's book and beyond, of course. I also thought it's fair to put a caveat in at the beginning, and actually in line with Kathy's warning, which she says, and she's wary in Ora Pro Nobis about examining images on their own, and by that she means without taking into account the context for them, and particularly the text that they may accompany, that sort of thing, on the basis, unsurprisingly, that it can lead to misleading interpretations. The other warning given by Kathy, which is a sort of almost like a post-it note on my computer screen, is that she points out, I think, very clearly the difficulties and the pitfalls in trying to attach a single meaning to any one sign or image in medieval art. And I feel that both of these warnings are particularly pertinent when we are dealing with an iconographically unique image, such as the Quinity image that you have up on screen in front of you today. So heeding Kathy's advice, and I step forward, and what I want to do in this brief paper is to try and let the miniatures speak for themselves, tell their own story through an examination of the iconography, but also to investigate how they function within the context of this prayer book, and both individually and as a group. And I'll also be looking at how the links between text and image can help understand the meanings within. And I'll be looking at the place where the manuscript was made, and also the man, briefly, for whom it was made for. So this is Alfred's prayer book, and you'll see straight away that it is not a single manuscript. It was originally one complete manuscript, but was divided shortly after joining the collection of Sir Robert Cotton in 1621. So Alfred's prayer book, in fact, consists of two manuscripts in the British Library, Cotton Titus D 26 and 27. Contrary to the numbering in the British Library, it's actually 27 that is the first manuscript. It is the opening to the prayer book. It starts with the calendar, and it's followed by D26. You'll notice that D26 has a modern 1960s British Library binding, whereas D27 still has its original Cottonian binding. The other thing I wanted to highlight at the outset is the diminutive size of this manuscript, which is obviously not available or not instantly obvious when you're looking at it on screen. It is easily able to fit into the palm of one hand. It's about 12 centimeters by 9 centimeters. And the size is significant. Not only is it significantly smaller than other comparable manuscripts that survive from this period, prayer book manuscripts, but also I think it conveys a sense of the object's purpose and how it functioned. It was made in the 1020s for a monk named Alfred, and we know that Alfred was dean of the monastery of the New Minster in Winchester, and we know that the prayer book was made in the period while he was dean, but before he became abbot in around 1031 or 32. It comprises prayers, church offices, computistical, liturgical material, a charm for finding a thief, and also a recipe for curing boils. So it's a real miscellany. And crucially for the purposes of today, it includes these three wonderful miniatures, which I'm showing to you on screen now. They depict the crucifixion, the Quinity in the middle, and this wonderful image of St. Peter. The artist executed the miniatures using the coloured outline drawing technique, using light colour shading and relying on a very limited palette of red, blue, green and brown. Past studies of this prayer book have really concentrated, I think, to the detriment of the sort of collective experience on the Quinity, on the image in the middle. And little consideration has really been given to, I think, the interaction between the Quinity with the other miniatures in the book and how it plays its part as part of this cohesive framework. Two of the miniatures, the Quinity and also the crucifixion, include depictions of the Virgin Mary, so they're going to be my main focus today. Before I launch into exploring these images with you, I just wanted to say a brief word to provide some context about where the prayer book comes from, which is Winchester. So Winchester in late Anglo-Saxon times was a centre of royal and religious power. Alfred lived in Winchester in the generation following Bishop and Saint Athelwold. And Athelwold, together with Dunstan and Oswald, was responsible for the Benedictine reform movement, which transformed English monasticism in the 10th century. Both Athelwold's personal legacy and indeed the reform movement itself were still very influential in Winchester in the 11th century. As I've said, Alfred was a monk and he was based at the monastery of the New Minster. Now, this had been founded by the son of King Alfred in the early 10th century. And it was dedicated to the Holy Trinity, St. Mary and St. Peter. Now, clearly, these three dedicatees are very significant for our understanding of the miniatures in the prayer book. But devotion to the Trinity, Mary and Peter was not limited to the pages of this manuscript, far from it. In fact, it was exemplified in the decorative scheme of the tower of the New Minster, which was built in the last quarter of the 10th century. And we're lucky to have in the preamble to the Liber Vitae, the Book of Life, which lists the benefactors of the New Minster, whose names will be commemorated throughout the year. And the Liber Vitae gives us some information about the tower, which is very precious, given how often we're missing this kind of information in medieval sources. And we're told, quote, "It was a tower of marvellous height and extraordinary beauty, the like of which never existed in this country in times past, and which appears unique to travellers over manifold regions and holy places." End quote. Sadly, the tower no longer survives. However, we're told that it was 6 stories high and adorned with carvings on every level. The lowest level started with the Virgin Mary, accompanied by a choir of virgins, possibly depicted in a sort of frieze over the portal. The second story, moving up, was carved to the honour of the undivided unity of the Holy Trinity. Above that was a carving of the crucifixion, and the remaining 3 stories were dedicated to the All Saints, to Archangel Michael, and finally in the uppermost story, the 4 evangelists. So it is from this devotional climate that the prayer book emerges. So starting with the first miniature to appear in the prayer book, that of the crucifixion, for me, it is the face of the crowned crucified Christ that is the sort of crux, if you like, of this image. Eyes turned towards the Virgin, who's depicted in this orans pose, looking up at her son, and I think a moment captured with great sensitivity by the artist. To the other side of Christ stands St. John. Both John and Mary, you'll notice, have their names inscribed in Latin, either side of their halos. John also looks at Christ, but his hand is holding a stylus, and he has a book open, ready to write a witness to the crucifixion. And the personifications of the sun and moon are above the cross with their Latin names. Now, in many respects, this crucifixion is typical of others that survive from this period. And I'm showing you a wonderful example by way of contrast from the Ramsey Psalter, also from Winchester, a bit earlier than Alfred's prayer book, dating from the last quarter of the 10th century. You can see, I hope, in the comparison of these images that, again, the figure of Christ dominates the composition. And the Ramsey artist's particularly delicate penwork, I think, conveys with exceptional beauty that the pathos and sadness of the scene. And this is the fact that Christ in the Ramsay Psalter depiction is dead. We know that because his eyes are closed and his side is bleeding. And we look to the Virgin who is weeping into her mantle. So by contrast, the prayer book artist has chosen to show Christ alive, vigorously so, crowned and looking, engaging in eye contact with his mother. And when I had the chance to look at this manuscript pre-COVID in the reading room at the British Library, I looked my way through all the pages of the manuscript, and I looked with interest at the extract from the Passion of St. John, which precedes the miniature in the prayer book. And I noticed that at the passage which describes, if you like, the events in the miniature, where Christ speaks to his mother and to John before his death. And he says to his mother, he speaks to his mother and says, "Behold, woman, behold your son," which I'm just highlighting here with my cursor. And then moments later, he speaks to John and he says, "Ecce mater tua," behold your mother. And I noticed that these crosses have been marked over the words and indeed also over the sentence that describes the death of Christ. Did Alfred mark these crosses? I mean, of course, we can never know, but it's surely possible. And I think it is a sort of tangible evidence of this personal meaning of the crucifixion for Alfred, which is also made clear in the words above the cross, which I've given you the text of on the slide, which reads, "This cross, hanging on which God drew all things to himself, seals Alfwyn in body and mind." So this phrasing, I think, makes it very clear the personal devotion between Alfwyn and the cross. And this is consistent with the long series of prayers and devotions to the cross, which follow the miniature in the manuscript. These include 7 prayers, which are all directed to individual parts of Christ's body: his left and right foot, left and right hand, his side, his mouth, his ears. And the crucifixion miniature, I think, may well have functioned as a sort of visual focus intended to be meditated on when reciting these devotions, particularly as the prayers are prefixed with the instruction that they should be read in front of a crucifix. Kathy, when she discussed the use of images, referenced Rupert of Deutz, and she gave the example of Rupert, who was drafting his commentary on the Song of Songs while contemplating the face of the Virgin. And it prompted Kathy to ask whether the picture of the Virgin was already in the mind of Rupert, or whether it existed materially, or indeed whether even this distinction was conscious or not. Now, of course, we don't know how Alfred used these miniatures, but it seems significant to me that this miniature of all is the most worn. It's in the poorest condition, suggesting to me that perhaps it was venerated by touch, maybe by kissing, and it was frequently referenced and venerated. Moving on now to the Quinity. This extraordinary and, as I say, iconographically unique image is the one that's been sort of debated and reproduced many times since Ernst Kantorowicz really gave the first sustained examination of the iconography in 1947. And it was Kantorowicz that coined the phrase Quinity in describing these 5 persons that appear within the circular aureole or glory. So what are we looking at? We can see 5 figures. The 2 near identical figures are seated, represent God the Father, and on his right, God the Son. Standing next to God, the Son, is Virgin Mary holding the Christ child, and she's veiled and crowned. And above her head is perched, rather precariously, the dove of the Holy Spirit. The Christ child, similarly to the Holy Spirit and God the Father and God the Son, all wear cruciform nimbus, and they all hold books. Now, there are many extraordinary things about this image, but one of the most striking, I think, is the appearance of Christ twice within the same image, both as a child on Mary's lap and then next to his father. And this is what led Kantorowicz to describe it as a Quinity, this 5 persons. Kantorowicz unpicked the iconography and drew back to the Utrecht Psalter, which he felt was fundamental to the understanding of the artist's inspiration. This wonderful manuscript was not made in England, but arrived in Canterbury during the course of the 10th century. And it's possible that it may have been in Winchester at some time, or scribes and artists from Winchester certainly saw it. Anyway, it was enormously influential to Anglo-Saxon artists. And we can see here on screen the folio of Psalm 109, and it's a great exemplar of the literal style that the artist of this wonderful manuscript favoured, and it depicts the opening line of Psalm 109. The Lord said to my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. So essentially what the artist is doing in the Alfred's prayer book is combining elements from Psalm 109, the two-seated lords trampling their enemies, with elements from the Gloria image, which shows God the Father seated with the Lamb on his left and Mary holding the Christ child with the dove, and also the Credo, which is compositionally similar. So the prayer book artist has taken elements, but then gone off on his own interpretation and his own creative journey. And this shouldn't surprise us, because certainly in Winchester and more broadly in Anglo-Saxon England in this period, there is evidence of enormous creativity, both in text and image, relating to the Trinity and also to the Virgin. The other unusual aspect of this miniature, of course, is the figures below the divine. And we're looking here at the naked shackled figure of a devil about to tumble into a hell mouth, and either side of which we are told in the text are Arius and Judas. Arius was a 4th century heretic, notorious for the originator of the Arian heresy, which in a brief nutshell doubted and he disagreed with the co-equality of the Father and the Son. Arius felt that Christ was subordinate to God, and therefore that the Father and Son were not equals, not consubstantial. And this was a very serious challenge for the fledgling Christian church, and also fundamentally challenged this notion of Christ being able to provide salvation. So the Emperor Constantine took action, summoned the Council of Nicaea in 325. Arius was declared a heretic and anathematized, and the doctrine of the Creed and the Nicene Creed emerged. But what's he doing in a 10th century or 11th century manuscript emanating from Winchester? We certainly have no evidence of Arian heresy in Winchester in this period. But what we do have is survivals of sermons and homilies from men like Alfred of Ancient. And Alfred makes very conscious comparisons with Arius and with the doctrine of the Trinity. And he warns against doubting the co-equality of the Trinity, and uses Arius, if you like, as a kind of emblem of an arch heretic. And I suspect that is exactly what Arius is doing here. He stands for all heretics that doubt the co-equality of God, in the same way that poor Judas with his drooping spear stands for all Jews who denied that Christ was God. But let's turn now to look at Mary, as this is the purpose of the day. And I think Mary is often overlooked in discussions about this image. And I feel that some scholars have even described her as subordinate, that her inclusion is something of an afterthought. And I was interested to read feminist theologian Sarah Coakley, who feels very strongly about this image, and says, describing Mary as being, quotes, significantly excluded from the inner and all-male magic circle, end quotes, commenting upon the intense sense of exclusion signalled by the left-hand portion of the picture. Now, obviously, such an interpretation, that's what she thinks. I feel, however, that it's ignoring the climate of Marian devotion in Winchester in this period. Winchester also innovates this, it has this innovative and exploratory spirit, which results in these progressive texts which explore and which are so key to the cult of the Virgin, which is forming and so predominant in Winchester. The texts of the prayer book help here. There are special offices to the Trinity, to the Virgin Mary, and to the Holy Cross. And these special offices appeared in England in the time following the monastic reform movement. And they were either used in the context of private devotion, but also could have been used in public liturgy. And at Winchester, services to the Virgin Mary, to St. Peter and St. Paul and All Saints were all introduced by Athelwold. So I think that's helpful to us in understanding perhaps our understanding of Mary and the fact that she's not a subordinate figure. And indeed, the office of the Virgin may have been Athelwold's personal invention. His devotion to Mary was well known, and Winchester, as I say, was an early centre of Marian devotion. The special office itself to Mary in the prayer book includes 4 prayers to the Virgin, including O Virgo Virginum, which is only appearing in other Winchester manuscripts. And this prayer requests the intercession of the Virgin of Virgins, Mother of Lord Jesus, and Queen of all the angels. These are all attributes, I think, which are visualized in the Trinity miniature, with Mary's crown, of course, underlining her additional role as Queen of Heaven. And further evidence of Alfred's personal devotion to the Virgin is in the notable fact that there are 6 invocations to the Virgin in the Litany of Saints, which follows later in the manuscript. Some scholars have explained or tried to explain Mary's position in this image as an attempt by the artist to explore the dual nature of Christ, Christ human and divine. And so we see Christ incarnate on his mother's lap, but also divine next to his father. This is very dangerous territory by medieval standards, verging on heresy, however, because depicting Christ's two natures in this way might be construed as implying that the Son of God and the Son of Man were two separate persons, when in fact clearly they are not. They are one person in Christ. So I think it's unlikely that a potentially heretical image like this would have emerged from Winchester in this period. Now, of course, Cathy considered this image in Ora Pro Nobis, and it was part of her examination of images depicting Mary as the Empress of Hell. And she felt, unsurprisingly, that again, the role of the Virgin in this image was essential and not subordinate, and proposed that the iconography is best understood as a sort of series of combinations. The Virgin as the instrument of the incarnation, yes, but also Mary as a prototype for redeemed humanity. And her importance obviously as an intercessor, ensuring that man doesn't forfeit heaven and tumble into hell. Just to conclude, I wanted to highlight a roughly contemporary poem, which I think backs up this theory of Cathy's very neatly. It's from a poem known as Judgment Day 2, and it's named Judgment Day 2 to distinguish it from Judgment Day 1, which appears in the Exeter book. Judgment Day 2 appears in a sort of compilation with a compilation of texts, homilies, legal material, and other prayers, now in the Library of Corpus Christi in Cambridge. And it's based on Bede's poem on Judgment Day, and it reveals in all its horror the moment when Christ comes, the second coming, to judge mankind. And I'm just going to read you the final section of the poem, which reveals the joys of heaven peopled by the throng of patriarchs, prophets, and saints, led by Mary, who's described as, quotes, God's matchless beloved, that lady and pure young woman, who for our sake bore the Lord, the Creator on earth. That is Mary, best of maidens, flanked by the Father and the Son in a noble company, and by the everlasting heavenly family that she, being most blessed of them all, leads through the beautiful shining realms of her celebrated Father. So I think locating Mary with the Father and the Son in heaven seems to me to be exactly what the prayer book artist was doing. It doesn't seem to me at all likely that he was trying to present a conventional Trinity. If he'd wanted to do that, he could have done so clearly. Instead, he wants to address the incarnation, and he wants to address, I think he also is trying to evoke the sort of eschatological overtones of judgment through the presence of Arius, Judas, and the Hellmouth. So I think, echoing Cathy's earlier warning that I started with, further support can be found in Michael Camille, who comments that for a monk, there was no single meaning, no such thing as a single meaning. And I think for a monk like Alfred, whose training would have resulted in him being able to store words and images and combine them on sort of multiple levels of allegory and meaning, would speak volumes in terms of how he would have approached an image like this. So I think trying to assess this miniature, and indeed the others in the book, and I haven't had time to talk about the miniature of St. Peter, is not to look at them or not to seek in them single meanings, but instead to kind of view them as offering a sort of multiple levels of understanding. They could enhance the text that they were presented with, or they could stand alone. They could offer the possibility of a private meditative journey for a monk, perhaps like when Alfred was beyond the confines of the monastery, and they encompass themes of incarnation and judgment. But fundamentally, they reflect most, I think, sincerely, this contemporary devotion centered around the Virgin and the Trinity and St. Peter, which we've already discovered was so prevalent. And my final thought really is, don't we wish sorely that the tower of the New Minster survived in some form, and we could see how the artists depicted the dedicatees of the New Minster. But I would like to bet that we would recognise, at least on some level, some of the iconography on a micro level within the prayer book pages of Alfwyn. I'll stop showing my screen.
Well, thank you very much, Teresa. That was terrific. Actually, it's inspired various thoughts in me as regards the sort of ruminative qualities of monasticism. Anyway, I'd like to exhort all of you listeners and viewers to save up your questions, or not necessarily save them up, but deposit them in the Q&A box, and we'll review the questions at the actual end of the session. And I'd like now to invite Sally Dorma to share her screen. Sally is director of the early medieval course at the V&A, of course, a course with which Cathy was very closely involved. And she herself, Sally, has worked extensively also on manuscript illumination and indeed drawing, particularly drawing. And she's going to return to the map psalter, which I think is a subject that she spent a lot of time considering over many years. Over to you, Sally.
Thank you, John. First of all, I just wanted to share with you my recollections, abiding recollections of Cathy, who I first encountered when, as an undergraduate, in my summer holidays, I was fortunate enough to work at the V&A. And Cathy was then a lecturer in the education department, as it was then known, famed for enthralling a lecture theatre full of 400 A-level students, talking to them about Chaucer or Shakespeare and the material culture of the medieval period. And subsequently, Cathy and I became friends and colleagues. And as John said, Cathy and I were involved in setting up the early medieval year course at the V&A some now 10 or 11 years ago. And Cathy was always the most supportive colleague. If I forgot about giving a lecture, Cathy would step in and do it in my stead, or vice versa. She was tremendously inspiring, full of wonderful ideas. And as so many of the other speakers today have already said, immensely generous with her ideas, and always excited and passionate about teaching the material that she loved. So yes, as John also said, the map psalter is a manuscript that I have spent a lot of time thinking about. First of all, back in the 1980s when I was doing my MA at the Courtauld. I'm going to pop my camera off and I am going to begin and focus on one particular illustration in the map psalter, which is best known for its eponymous world map. But in addition to that, the map psalter, which I should just confirm, lives now in the British Library and is additional manuscript 28681. It also contains a little considered full-page frontispiece of the Virgin and Child on folio 190 verso. So here on the left is the recto of the world map folio, and on the right, the Virgin and Child composition that we're going to focus on. One aspect of the Virgin and Child composition, the Virgin's leonine footstool down here, just find my laser pointer here, is going to provide the focus of this paper, which Cathy kindly read and in typically generous fashion commented upon a fuller version before I submitted it for publication in John Loudon's Festschrift, Illuminating the Middle Ages, published by Brill in 2020. First, let's start with some basics about the book. It has been trimmed down, possibly to fit the current post-medieval binding, and the calendar, of which you're looking at the page for April on the left, indicates that the book was produced somewhere between circa 1262 and circa 1280. The feast day of St. Richard of Chichester, who was canonized in 1262, is included on the 3rd of April here, but his translation on the 16th of June in 1276, although present, has been added by a different hand. The original illustrations, which consist of the world map, 10 historiated Psalter division initials, one of which you see here for Psalm 101, and the Virgin and Child illustration, imply in various ways a London or Westminster provenance. The world map suggests knowledge of mid-13th century royal commissions, like Henry III's now lost Mappa Mundi in the Palace of Westminster. The style of the world map and the Virgin and Child illustration implies connections with artists convincingly localized to Westminster or royal patronage, and the unusual iconography of the historiated initials, Psalms 38 and 80, indicate connections with psalters associated with London. Internal evidence suggests an ecclesiastical patron, possibly the Benedictine monk kneeling in Psalm 101's initial, often the initial chosen to depict the donor or patron. The calendar, if you're wondering, is not Benedictine, but St. Benedict heads the list of confessors in the litany, suggesting that at the very least, the model for the litany was Benedictine. And St. Peter crops up twice in the litany, suggesting potentially a Westminster connection. The volume's relatively small size, it's 16.9 centimetres in height and 12.6 centimetres in width, so a little smaller than a present-day paperback. Together with the inclusion of personalised Latin and French prayers in the masculine form, a Psalter of the Virgin and the Office of the Dead indicates private use by a patron of modest means. And many of the pages are grubby, actually not these two, particularly at their bottom edges indicating regular protracted use. The Virgin and Child frontispiece is an integral part of the book. It's situated opposite the prologue of a Psalter of the Virgin, a very abbreviated Psalter used for private devotion. The opening verse of each psalm, I show you a page beyond the prologue on the right. So the opening verse of each psalm is supplied in red, preceding a 4-line rhyming quatrain that extols the Virgin's multiple virtues, 4 quatrains per page. Psalters of the Virgin, or Ave Psalters as they're sometimes known, circulated in various versions from the 11th to the 13th century. None is precisely dated. Some are anonymous, others attributed to ecclesiastical English and Italian authors. Anselm of Canterbury, who died in 1109, is the earliest, and others include St. Edmund of Canterbury, who died in 1240, and St. Bonaventure, who died in 1274. These abbreviated Marian Psalters often occur in association with other Marian devotional material from the early 13th century onwards, particularly in Psalters made for Benedictine and Augustinian patrons. And from 1250 onwards, when the recitation of such texts had become entrenched in the secular liturgy, they proliferate predominantly in lay Psalters. 11 Psalters in Nigel Morgan's early Gothic manuscripts illuminated in the British Isles, Volume 2, looking at books between 1250 and 1285, contain a Psalter of the Virgin, but the map Psalters version is unique, beginning Ave Virgo Virginum, parens absque pari, Hail Virgin of Virgins, obedient without comparison. No author is specified for this version, but it's been attributed to Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, who died in 1228. Only 4 of the 11 Psalters of the Virgin catalogued by Morgan are illustrated. All 4 employ Marian themes, but only the map Psalter has a full-page frontispiece. The other 3 open with historiated initials. Our Mother and Son sit frontally on a stool throne beneath a pointed cinquefoil arch supported on slender colonnettes, flanked on either side by a censer-swinging angel. The Virgin grasps a foliate-topped scepter in her right hand and holds the wriggling child aloft in the crook of her left arm. Her feet rest upon a male lion with curled mane, his head in profile, who strides towards our right, his left forepaw raised. The Virgin and Child shares a family resemblance with, but has evidently been drawn by someone junior to, or perhaps less accomplished than the hands responsible for the world map. The Virgin's head, you'll note, is disproportionately small, her torso unreasonably etiolated, and her legs anatomically distorted. Her left foot is placed higher than her right, even though her knees are level. Stylistically and technically, this illustration is related in a general sense to a group of contemporary manuscripts linked with Westminster, books like the Morgan Apocalypse in New York and La Histoire de Saint-Edouard le Roi in Cambridge University Library. which have drawn rather than painted illustrations. The choice of drawing technique for our frontispiece demonstrates the continuation of a well-established English tradition where a hierarchy of technique is employed to establish the relative importance of text within a book. The Psalter's historiated division initials were deemed most significant and thus fully painted. A drawing technique, partial tinting, was chosen for our frontispiece since it introduces a non-biblical text. The map Psalter Virgin and Child stands out amidst contemporary English examples of Virgin and Child images in three respects: the child's contorted pose, the Virgin's completely uncovered head, she has no veil or crown, and I discuss both of those iconographic oddities in my Loudon Festschrift article, and the leonine footrest, which concerns us here. Lions played varied roles in 13th century imagery. In lay commissions, they feature on coats of arms, and frequent male company as emblems of courage set beneath the feet of tomb effigies, while female effigies rest their feet, more typically upon dogs, to signal fidelity. In the sacred realm, only one woman, the Virgin Mary, is shown in proximity to lions, and then not frequently, certainly not in England. But such images, which were produced in small numbers in 13th century England and in continental Europe, have been documented by P. Bloch in his article Die Muttergottes auf dem Lohen, which came out in 1970, and by Nigel Morgan in his article on texts and images of Marian devotion in 13th century England, published in the Harlexton English Medieval Studies series in 1991. For our purposes, the lack of surviving 3D images from 13th century England rather limits our discussion to two-dimensional examples of the type. Here's a close-up of our lion, which I will come back to in a moment or two. But the moralizing bestiary text, perhaps the most accessible place to gauge contemporary knowledge of the animal kingdom, reassures the reader that lions attack men rather than women and will only kill children if ravenous. But even with such assurances, the juxtaposition of a ferocious beast with an unarmed young mother and her infant son may seem paradoxical. Medieval viewers, aware that biblical lions, rather like serpents, symbolized contradictory qualities, sometimes negative, sometimes positive, the pairing will have made absolute sense, confirming Mary and Christ's role in the subjugation of evil and the promise of resurrection. The prone, defeated lion and similarly prostrate dragon pinned beneath the Virgin's feet, as in the mid-13th century image in the Amesbury Psalter, English manuscript, refers to the trampling of the beasts and associated suppression of evil by Christ, as prophesied in Psalm 91, verse 13, which says, "Thou shalt tread upon the lion and adder, the young lion and the dragon shalt thou trample under feet." It's worth noting that Christ, on the verso of the map, Psalter's Mappa Mundi, which you're looking at on the right, has his feet firmly planted upon the heads of two winged serpents, presumably to express that sentiment of trampling. In a more positive fashion, lion cubs or whelps, which I think we can presume are pictured here, three of them seen playing at the Virgin's feet in the Missal of Henry of Chichester, another mid-13th century English book that features the Virgin in the company of lions, are analogous to the resurrection of Christ, associated with the bestiary's description of how the Father breathed new life into his cubs 3 days after their birth, as illustrated here on the right in the Northumberland Bestiary, now in the John Paul Getty Museum in California. also mid-13th century and English. Solitary, confident, almost regal, the map Psalter lion is unlike other English 13th century lions. The Virgin's feet rest only lightly upon him, one on the crown of his head, the other on his haunches. She is not trampling him, I think. He strides forwards, alert, purposeful, and benign. His mouth is open, but he doesn't snarl or roar, and his tail drags behind him. In a practical sense, he acts as a compositional aid, pacing forwards to direct the reader's attention to the opening of the text on the following page. His presence has definitely been planned for, because without him, the Virgin's feet would dangle in mid-air. The Psalter of the Virgin text in the map Psalter does not mention a lion. So how should we interpret this handsome creature? Could he be heraldic? Well, in terms of design of head, mane, and musculature, he bears a general resemblance to the lion on Simon de Montfort, 6th Earl of Leicester's coat of arms, as carved and painted circa 1260 on a shield in the North Choir aisle of Westminster Abbey, which you can see at the top. And I'm grateful to Sally Dixon-Smith, who brought this example to my attention. But using the language of heraldry, our lion is passant rather than rampant, and he faces right, i.e. to sinister, highly unusual in a coat of arms. Further, his tail is neither erect nor forked. The hairs at its tip might appear to be parted, but close inspection confirms otherwise. The base of the throne is not visible through the brush, making it unlikely, I think, that he references de Montfort, arch enemy of Henry III, however tantalizing such a connection might be. Rather than conveying a heraldic message, our lion seems to embody positive sacred themes, linking Old Testament figures with Mary and her son in typological fashion. He keeps company in some respects with the three diminutive lions on the step of the Virgin's throne in the Missal of Henry of Chichester that we saw before. Cathy, in her magisterial work, Ora Pro Nobis, suggested that as well as referencing resurrection, this trio alludes to the throne of Solomon, as described in 1 Kings chapter 10 and 2 Chronicles chapter 9, where 12 lions adorn the throne, 6 pairs on the steps, with 2 further lions beneath the armrests, as depicted on the right in the full-page miniature in a late 13th century French manuscript, The Orchard of Solace, Theologiae Speculum de Verger de Soulas, now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, insecurely dated, but I think second half of the 13th century is probable. French and German examples featuring single lions may also signify this royal seat. 2 mid-12th century capitals from southwest France of the adoration of the Magi, one from St. Etienne at Toulouse, which I don't have an illustration of, I'm afraid, now in Toulouse in the Augustin Musée. The other in the V&A, pictured up here at the top left, from Sainte-Marie de Lombez, southwest of Toulouse. And I think you can just see here, if I zoom in, the prostrate figure of a lion, although his head seems to be raised, which perhaps suggests that Mary is not trampling him, but he has other significance. Add to this the emblematic lion mask below the throne in the Psalter known variously as the St. Blasian Psalter or Dyson-Perrin Psalter, now in private hands, made in the Swiss-German region circa 1240, and the half-seated lion beneath the Virgin's feet, originally a piece of sculpture on the west facade of Santa Maria in Capitol in Cologne, now displayed in the nave, which has been variously dated between the middle of the 12th and the middle of the 13th centuries, but stylistically, to my mind, consistent with an earlier date. The map Psalter illustration stands alone as an English example of this type, with a lone lion, but establishes a compositionally ingenious and unique visual link with Solomon's throne by setting the mother and son beneath a complex architectural canopy, and by substituting an animated leonine footstool for the more typical box-shaped footrest or steps at the throne's base. By extension, here, I think, the Virgin signifies Solomon's throne as the sedes sapientiae, an idea developed by 12th century authors who interpreted the Old Testament passages cited above in conjunction with Luke chapter 1, where Mary learns that her son will receive the throne of David, Solomon's father. Read from bottom to top, our illustration indicates Solomon's earthly wisdom flowing through the Virgin, Solomon's descendant and Christ's mother, to reach completion in the heavenly wisdom of the infant Christ, positioned purposefully above the lion's head. Leonine Solomonic imagery was already established in royal English circles by 1260. Henry III and subsequently Edward I forged visual associations with Solomon's throne to glorify their kingship. Their seals, here on the right, Henry III's at the top and Edward I below, present them enthroned with lions beneath their feet and here at the sides of their throne. And Edward's now lost wooden throne, St. Edward's chair, is recorded as having a king resting his feet on a lion painted on the back. Such images, perhaps reinforced by a knowledge of the three lions, I promise I won't say any more about the three lions given the importance of the day on which I'm giving this paper, although of course I was unaware of that when I was putting it together. Such images, perhaps reinforced by knowledge of the three lions in the Tower of London's Royal Menagerie, originally presented to Henry III by the Emperor Frederick II in 1235, which were regarded as living expressions of the royal arms of England, may have informed the invention of the map Psalter's animated footstool, thereby referencing and reinforcing a Solomonic link with England's monarchs in the second half of the 13th century. This, I think, is not all. Our solitary walking lion may additionally refer to another Old Testament Christological precedent, the Lion of Fuda, the creature Jacob employs to characterize the tribe of Judah, his son, in Genesis 49, where he says in verse 9, "Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey my son has gone up. He stooped down, he couched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall raise him up?" This messianic prophecy, confirming Christ's royal lineage and future kingdom, is explicitly referenced in Revelation chapter 5. Verse 5 says, "Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, hath prevailed to open the book." The placement of our lion's head directly beneath Christ establishes a visual link between the Old Testament ancestor and the incarnate Messiah. The Genesis text reveals the paradoxical nature of the Lion of Judah, youthful as a whelp, and yet controlled. And the map Psalter lion illustrates these qualities, informed either perhaps by the Old Testament text, or given two very specific details, the bestiary text. Numerous illustrated copies of the bestiary were made in 13th century England. Presumably, therefore, that text was relatively well known. And in the bestiary, it says that old lions lack teeth. Our lion's two prominent teeth confirm his youth. The bestiary also relates how when pursued by hunters, a lion will ingeniously erase his tracks with his tail. Behavior analogous, the text says, with Christ remaining hidden in heaven until he assumed human form. Most lions, as in the Northumberland bestiary illustration I showed you earlier, here again on the right, display their tails flamboyantly above their backs, or tuck them meekly behind their hind legs. Our lion drags his tail behind him, brushing the ground with its tip as he walks forward. And it's worth noting that the trio of lions in the Missal of Henry of Chichester do the same. The traditional physical association between the Lion of Judah and the Virgin is generally accepted as a type invented in Germany in the middle to late 13th century, a type which remained prevalent there into the 15th century. An eccentric metalwork statuette made somewhere between circa 1280 and 1310, with later additions and reworkings from the Upper Rhineland, now in Basel Cathedral Treasury, is one of the earliest examples. A diminutive, standing Virgin and Child, holding her son, balances on a mid-13th century cameo of a standing lion set, it looks to me, although I haven't seen this in person, I'm afraid, to be set into a ring that sits around the waist of the half-length figure of King David, against whom the Virgin leans. King David, descendant of Judah, who holds a scroll declaring, King David, of strong hands and fortuitous vision, declares, behold my descendant, the saviour of the world, whom with divine inspiration I have prophesied. The map Psalter seems to demonstrate a precocious and apparently unique English example of the Lion of Judah in Mary and Christ's company, either invented in London, where an interest in the symbolism of lions was well established, or perhaps informed by portable items brought from the Holy Roman Empire in association with high-level 13th century connections. Emperor Frederick II, with whom cameos of walking lions have been associated, most recently in an exhibition at the Sam Fogg Gallery in London. I show you an example from that down at the bottom on the right. The Emperor Frederick II married Henry III's sister Isabel in 1235, and Henry III's younger brother, Richard of Cornwall, of course, was King of Germany from 1257 until 1272. During negotiations to acquire the map Psalter from Henry D. Jones of 22 Albin Street, Hyde Park, London, it was eventually purchased by the British Museum, as it was then, in 1872 for the sum of £65. A BM librarian remarked in a letter to the trustees dated 16th of March 1871 that the manuscript's interest lay in, I quote, its connecting certain characters of work with England. The leonine footstool in the Virgin and Child frontispiece definitely confirms the inventiveness of English Marian iconography. It also affirms the iconographic versatility of lions in the company of Our Lady.
Thank you very much indeed, Sally, for that. I'm quite taken, in fact, by the occasional maxim that seemed to come out there, particularly old lions lack teeth. But I'd like to continue now. And as I said earlier, then please type your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll put those to the speakers at the end of the session. Our next contributor, and the last before lunch, is Cecily Hennessey. Cecily is Academic Director of Christie's Education, and very much a Byzantinist, really, but with interests that range around Europe and around the Mediterranean much more widely. Cecily is going to be talking about the mystery of the Mother of God and her companion in the homilies of James Coquina-Baffos. Over to you, Cecily. Cecily, by the way, you're muted. Cecily?
There we go. Sorry about that. Apologies. I just wanted to say thank you to Sally for inviting me. Thank you to John for your introduction, and also thank you to Richard for hosting us today. And as John said, we're turning here from the Western medieval world to the Eastern, to Byzantium. So when I was researching the representation of children in Byzantium, I noticed a rather odd recurrence of a small boy in two important 12th century manuscripts. These manuscripts both contain the text of the homilies of a monk named James Kokinabathos. The 6 homilies are about the life of the Virgin. They each show the Ascension at the beginning of the books. The one on the left is in Paris at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and the one on the right at the Vatican. For the most part, I will be showing you illuminations from the Paris manuscript, but largely the iconography is the same in both editions. The figure that concerns me is this boy, shown with short hair, a red or blue tunic, who is the youngest son of Joseph and who takes on a surprisingly central role as the Virgin's companion and defender. Who he is or why he is there is still rather a mystery. And all in all, there is rather a lot of mystery concerning these manuscripts. We do not know exactly when they were made, who commissioned them, or for whom they were made. We do, however, know that the text was written by a monk named James, who was associated with a monastery called Kokinabathos. He tells us this. James's writing is derivative, relying on 3 main sources. First, 3 of the Church Fathers, John Chrysostom, Gregory of Nyssa, and George of Nicomedia. Second, the Gospels. And third, an apocryphal text known as the Infancy Gospel of James. This is the primary text used for stories of the early life of the Virgin. This originated in the late 2nd century and became popular in the 6th. It is purported to have been written by James, the brother of Jesus. But please don't confuse this with the James who wrote the manuscript. That is the monk James. His debt to John and Gregory is indicated in the frontispiece, which shows the Church Fathers with the monk James reaching up to John and kneeling before Gregory. I hope you can see them in the foreground here. James is wearing his monastic dress and is a mature, bearded man. The inscription in the table of contents reads, "The work of James, monk of the Kokinabathos Monastery, composed in 6 sermons, assembled for the feast of the All-Holy Mother of God." The location of the monastery, dedicated to the Theotokos to Kokinabathou, is not known. The 6 homilies discuss the attributes and virtues of the Virgin in the context of her life, and so many of the illustrations portray episodes in her story. This is told in great detail, and the illustrations include scenes not found elsewhere, which is what makes it to me so intriguing. However, there are also many details in the illuminations which bear no relation to the text, and their origins is part of the mystery. The apocryphal convention had it that the Virgin was born into a well-to-do family in Jerusalem. In the illustrations, indeed, she appears in a most luxurious, aristocratic world, and we could assume this is based on evidence of Constantinople. Here, for instance, she is tucked into her resplendent rocking cradle with tasseled sheets. We can see here a servant holding back a curtain, 2 servants here, one with a flabellum, one holding a bowl of milk, and then her parents, Anna and Joachim, at the foot of the cradle. Here, the Virgin is presented to the elders and to the high priest, and here given to the temple to be brought up there from the age of 3. She is then fed on the altar by an angel. She grows up, and the widower Joseph is chosen to be her husband. Here she is being given to him. It is at this point that the small boy I mentioned before starts to appear, and he appears repeatedly. He is here when the Virgin is first taken to the home of Joseph, and the couple are received by Joseph's sons. You can see the small boy is on the right, maybe eating something at the table. Joseph then tells the Virgin he is leaving to do some building work, and the sons stand behind them. Then we have the scene of the Annunciation, and you can see the boy is watching it all happen. Sometime later, the Virgin takes wool she has spun and puts it in a basket, which she gives to the boy. Then we see the Virgin on the road to the temple, preceded by the boy. Then in the temple, the Virgin hands the wool to Zechariah. Then she returns and sets out to visit Elizabeth. She rests on the banks of the Jordan, and the boy gathers flowers from a tree. Arriving at Elizabeth's house, the two women embrace. They have their meeting, and then they say goodbye. After Mary has returned home, Joseph also returns from his journey. He then questions the Virgin about the pregnancy, which is now evident. Rather nicely here, the boy is not present. This is a private scene between the couple. The following image shows the sadness of Joseph and his sons, and then in front of the sons, Joseph reproaches the Virgin. The Virgin defends herself, and then she is interrogated by a scribe in front of Joseph and the sons. Then Joseph and Mary are arrested and led in front of the Sanhedrin. In this scene, the boy is on the ground being beaten. The scribe then accuses her in front of the high priest, and she defends herself again. And after her trial, she is redeemed, and it is the boy who leads the procession, celebrating her innocence. Now, this role of the small boy seems remarkably prominent for a figure who is not mentioned in the text. He is therefore purely a visual feature of the book. Excuse me, John, I'm just going to shut my door because somebody's scraping outside. I don't know if you can hear it, but I can. Okay. So let us look at the textual evidence for this boy and for the brothers of Christ in the Gospels. The Gospel account from Mark regarding Jesus reads, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and of Judah and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" The account from Matthew reads similarly. From these texts, Christ seems to have 4 brothers and some sisters. These brothers mentioned in the Gospels are interpreted to be not the sons of Mary, but rather of Joseph, as the Virgin is supposed to remain a virgin throughout her life. Hence, in the Apocrypha, the brothers are attributed to Joseph's first marriage. In actuality, then, they are not brothers at all to Jesus, as they have neither the same father nor mother. So turning now from the Gospels to the apocryphal infancy Gospel of James, the author here does not state that he is the brother of Jesus, but merely ends his Gospel by saying, "Now I, James, am the one who wrote this account." However, this work is interpreted as being written by James, the brother of Jesus. In the text, Joseph says, "I'll enroll my sons, but what am I going to do with this girl?" He does not mention any daughters. When Joseph and Mary set out for the census in Bethlehem, the text says, "And so he, Joseph, saddles his donkey and had her get on it. His son led it, and Samuel or James or Simon," the text is differently in different sources, "they brought up the rear." But the text suggests that there are only 2 brothers. There are also sons, but only 2 in the famous mosaics at the Carrier Jami. These are in a former church in Istanbul, restored and redecorated in the early 14th century. The mosaics, similar to our manuscript, have extensive scenes showing the infancy of the Virgin. Joseph's sons can be seen, for instance, here on the right in the scene when they go to Jerusalem when Christ is 12, and on the left when the Virgin is taken to Joseph's home. The importance of the son James is highlighted in another apocryphal text, the story of Joseph the carpenter. This originated in the 5th century and gives the story of Christ's birth and of Joseph's death at the age of 111. Joseph, in his first marriage, begot for himself sons and daughters, 4 sons, namely, and 2 daughters. Now these are their names: Judas, Justus, James, and Simon. The names of the 2 daughters were Assia and Lydia. After Mary's marriage, when Joseph was 40, Mary found James the Less in his father's house, broken-hearted and sad on account of the loss of his mother, and she brought him up. Hence, Mary was called the mother of James. This familial configuration is not exactly conveyed in the images, as in our manuscripts the daughters are not present. However, the story of Joseph the carpenter gives James a special role as the bereft child who is adopted by his new stepmother. Presumably, this story is helping to account for the rather problematic title that a Mary in the Gospels is named as the mother of James the Less, and this is often assumed to be the Virgin. In our manuscript, he is depicted as the youngest and the one who both serves and protects her. This James went on to become the first bishop of Jerusalem and had an important role in the early church. In Cappadocia in Turkey, there are some early narrative nativity scenes which often show James as a youth, not as a small boy. This is an early example from Gurame. It's the old church at Takara Kalisi, painted in the 1st quarter of the 10th century. This is looking up into the ceiling vault. James is leading the donkey on the road to, oh, sorry, we've missed one. James is leading the donkey on the road to Bethlehem. And, oops, again, in the journey to Egypt. Other examples are at the 11th century church of Pancalog. There's the outside, and here is a scene of the flight to Egypt. And you can see the boy James is here leading the donkey. So these examples, I hope, indicate to you how this one boy or youth, James, became an accepted feature of narrative scenes of the Nativity. But he is usually shown as a single son, not as one of 4, as in the Cockinabathus manuscripts. It is widely assumed that the illuminator of the Cockinabathus manuscripts had access to an illustrated copy of the infancy Gospel of James. However, there is no surviving illustrated manuscript of this text. Furthermore, this does not explain the repeated presence of 4 sons, as only 2 are mentioned in the infancy Gospel. And it certainly does not explain the role taken by the little figure of James in our manuscript. The presence of 4 sons and the close relation of the Virgin and the boy indicates a source for the imagery in the story of Joseph the carpenter, but no illustrated copy of this has survived either. Regardless of sources, one asks why this particular iconography is chosen for the illustrations to the homilies, where it is not necessary in order to illustrate the text, in which, as I noted, no sons of Joseph are mentioned. So let's turn back to the author of the Cockinabathus homilies, James the monk. It is thought that a manuscript that has survived, containing letters to a Sebastocratorisa Irene, was written by James. And the theory is that they were written to Irene, the wife of Andronicus Komnenos, the 2nd son of the Emperor John II. And I've indicated them in bold here in the family tree. Andronicus was a Sebastocrator, an honorary title which made his wife a Sebastocratorisa. In the letters, the monk James refers to the difficulties Irene faced with the Emperor Manuel I, her brother-in-law, sometime after her husband's death in 1142. Her husband was in line to the throne prior to his death, and for some time after, Manuel kept Irene in confinement at various places in and around Constantinople. Manuel seems to have taken her to be a threat. She was a great patron of the arts and commissioned various pieces, as has been shown by Vasiliki Dimitropoulou. Amongst these are 6 works which she dedicated to the Virgin, mostly covers or liturgical cloths used as hangings to decorate or protect icons of the Virgin, such as the Virgin Hodegetria and the Virgin of Pege in Constantinople. Records of the inscriptions or dedicatory poems indicate her interests. She repeatedly implored protection for the health and safety of her children and salvation for her soul. In one poem offered to the Virgin, she asked for the protection of her second son, Alexius, who was on the point of death because of a raging fever. The text states that she was inflamed with the fire of passion while her son was very ill. Irene's central role as a mother is evident in these dedications and in James's letters to her. It is also apparent that Irene viewed the Virgin as her main protector. Geoffrey Anderson suggested that the manuscript in the Vatican, that's the one on the right, may have been given to Irene or commissioned by her. Elizabeth and Michael Jeffreys have tended towards the view that one or both of the manuscripts were commissioned by Irene, and this idea has been supported by Kaliroe Linardu and Maria Evangelatou. Linardu argues that a feminine focus in the illuminations make the book suitable for a female patron, and Evangelatou repeats the idea that the patron and recipient were female. Now, I have in the past also argued that the relatively important role of the youngest son, the youngest of Joseph's sons, may support the notion that Irene was the patron of the manuscripts. And I've shown textual evidence to show that Irene was particularly attached to her younger son, Alexius. He was born at Easter 1135, and I've added him here to the family tree. And he was only 7 when his father died. Alexius was imprisoned and exiled with his mother. And a poem by the poet Manganeus Prodromus expresses the grief she felt that an innocent child should suffer so. When the boy was taken from her by imperial decree to serve in the army with Manuel I, when he was aged 14 or so, the poet again expressed Irene's intense grief. This was a heart-wrenching event, for the boy had calmed the anguish of her imprisonment. It seemed to me that the presence of the youngest son in the manuscript could be a reference to Irene's son as her companion. However, in recognizing that there are 4 sons, one inevitably asks whether the apocryphal family bears any relation to, the 4 brothers, the sons of the Emperor John II, who was the father-in-law of Irene. Emperor John and his wife, also called Irene, had 4 sons, the eldest Alexius, then Andronicus, then Isaac, and the youngest Manuel. Now Manuel, shown here with his wife Maria, was 5 years younger than Isaac, and unexpectedly, and due to the wishes of his father, assumed the throne in 1143, aged 25, although his older brother Isaac was still living. Manuel was himself a prolific patron of texts, of buildings, and of art. Paul Magdaleno has estimated that he had more encomia addressed to him than any other Byzantine emperor. Several of these poems also concern Irene and her family. Magdaleno and Robert Nelson have also pointed out that from the textual evidence, Manuel had an exceptional number of portraits made on a variety of themes and in many contexts, and he promoted pictorial self-advertisement. One visual tool adopted by Manuel was the use of Christ Emmanuel on the coinage. This appears to have created a simultaneous vogue in painting as well. This type of Christ, showing a youthful figure, features in the center of the burning bush in one of the full-page illustrations in the Kokinabathos manuscripts, and this seems to be unique. In referencing Manuel's name, this childlike representation alluded to the emperor's identification with Christ. So, is there any argument for Manuel being the patron of the manuscripts? We know that male members of his family commissioned works from the Kokinabathos workshop. John II Komnenos, his father, commissioned the gospel book Vatican Urbis Graecus II, of which this is the frontispiece, and his uncle, Isaac Komnenos, the Seraglio Octateuch, showing in this image the plague of frogs. Now, much recent reflection on the Coccinabaphos manuscripts has lent towards the Sebastocrat Teresa Irene as patron and is noted for the feminization of the iconography. However, studies commonly accept that James the monk had a strong role in determining the subject of the miniatures. To my mind, it is not out of the question that a man was the patron of at least one of the manuscripts, and I am drawn to the idea that either one or both were commissioned by Manuel for his own use. My current stand is that this is the most plausible theory, but I have to grant that the weight of scholastic opinion favors Irene as the patron. Even if Irene were the patron, the iconography might be chosen to accentuate the elevated role of the fourth son, Emperor Manuel, whose favor Irene was bound to cull for her own safety and that of her children. Could Irene have commissioned the book for her powerful brother-in-law Manuel, perhaps even on the occasion when her most favored son Alexius joined Manuel on campaign? Conversely, could Manuel have commissioned the book for his widowed sister-in-law, but chosen iconography that elevated the status of himself, the fourth son? Or, as I've suggested, could he have commissioned it for his own use? So far, we have not found the answer to this mystery. I've been thinking about this for quite some time, and although I have to say, many now assume that these manuscripts were made for Irene or that she was the patron, I'm very much leading towards her brother-in-law Manuel as being instrumental in them. The fact that he was the fourth son and the presence of the Emmanuel image seems to me to accentuate the chances of him being the patron. So now returning to these frontispieces of the Ascension and the magnificent decoration of a 12th century Byzantine building, a church with 5 domes, perhaps showing us the interior, perhaps the exterior of a building, with elegant marble revetments and mosaics, with the Mother of God and the disciples standing below. It has been suggested that this represents the Church of the Holy Apostles, the traditional burial place of the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, or that it is heavenly Jerusalem itself, perhaps showing the Holy Sepulchre Church. But to my mind, it is perhaps more likely in the 12th century that it represents the Pantocrator Monastery, shown here in its present form as the Zerek Jami, and in an earlier drawing. This was the main imperial foundation in Constantinople in the first part of the 12th century, built by John II Komnenos, with a chapel for the Comnenian family mausoleum, housing the tombs of John and his wife, and later their sons Alexius and Andronicus, and eventually Manuel. Is this image at the front of the manuscript perhaps another indication that the patron is from the Comnenian family, either Manuel or his sister-in-law, Irene? So I hope this talk has given insight into 2 of the most highly illustrated and distinctive manuscripts of the Byzantine 12th century, and their focus on the Mother of God, the theme of our talks today to honor Cathy and the richness of her